for this film began with a simple question. Back when I was a regular person. I'd owned a few companies since college, my family had a son on the way, and life was good. That was February of 2011, when I first took a closer look at 9/11 and found something astonishing that conflicted with my belief system, that I couldn't deny, and that changed my life. From a simple question to a research obsession to a spiritual awakening. You can't write or talk about it because it needs to be seen to be believed. And that's how this film was born. At its core, it's a how-to movie, like how to see better. It's not meant to be about religion, politics, or history, but we'll definitely touch on those. So let's start at the beginning, when my eyes first opened. 9/11 itself didn't bring on this big life change, but it was the first domino to fall. If you want to peek behind the big curtain, get ready, because you're going to see some things that may test your beliefs and your notion of reality. So let's ease into it, because when you're coming out of eye surgery, that first light's going to be intense. My awakening began with a simple question. It occurred when I saw a familiar clip showing President Bush on the morning of 9/11. Bush is sitting at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida at 9:05 a.m. when White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispers the following into the president's ear.
The plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack.
The big question is this. Why didn't the Secret Service get him out of there immediately? They didn't know how many planes were hijacked yet or what their targets were.
There were actually 8 planes that were hijacked.
We had 11 reports of hijacked aircraft.
There were thousands of planes still flying. As many as a dozen planes were reported hijacked at one point. And it was no secret the president was there. The school visit had been made public on September 7th, 4 days prior to 9/11. How could anyone be so sure hijackers weren't already on the way? Yet there he lingered, even after 2 more flights were confirmed hijacked. Flight 77 and Flight 93, the Pentagon and Shanksville planes respectively. Somewhere I saw a story claiming the president's camp didn't want to scare the kids at the school and that's why he stayed, which I found laughable. Serious, smart, well-trained professionals are going to risk the balance of power in the world to spare the feelings of a few kids who routinely practice fire drills anyway? Well, I guess the answer was yes, because Bush stayed until 9:34 a.m., a full 31 minutes after the second plane hit. That would have been 31 grueling minutes for everyone, wondering if some hijackers got ambitious, maybe changed their plans in the last few days after the school visit was made public. If you rule out gross incompetence by the Secret Service, I guess someone high up in the president's camp must have known or thought they were safe. I mean, what else could it be? But how could anyone have known that? Definitely perplexing, but I wasn't thinking conspiracy or anything like that. After hours of research, I could find no plausible explanation about the Secret Service. At this point, I didn't suspect anything nefarious, but it was very curious. And more curious was the type of people I came across who also had questions about 9/11. These were people in government, aviation, civil defense, architecture, science, engineering, and the military. I decided to look further. I still had no idea the impact this would have on my life. I started by refamiliarizing myself with the incident, or I should say set of incidents. Of course, we all remember the second tower being hit, but I hadn't put much thought into the other attacks. And soon after looking, I was reminded that there were several incredible events that day, including a third building that fell at the World Trade Center. I put almost no thought into the particulars of that day for 10 years, but that was about to change. In chronological order, the official version goes like this. 4 planes were hijacked by 19 mostly Saudi Arabian terrorists who then flew or attempted to fly those planes into 4 U.S. buildings. 3 of them were successful. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, the North Tower, at 8:46 a.m. United Flight 175 hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed after burning for 59 minutes. At 10:07 a.m., the United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Then at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed after burning for 102 minutes. And to close out the day, a third building, Building 7 at the World Trade Center, collapsed at 5:20 p.m. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, more commonly known as NIST, verified the official government version, backing up what the pundits were saying within hours of the attacks, that fires had weakened the steel and caused all three buildings to fail, including Building 7, which oddly enough was not hit by an airplane.
That intense heat probably weakened the structure as well.
Listen to Shyam Sundar of NIST as he volunteers his position that buildings were not brought down by explosives. Until then, I didn't even know explosives were a part of the conversation.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
As I began to research the official government story, spearheaded by NIST, I saw a news flash that the 9/11 families wanted an investigation into World Trade Center 7. I was a bit surprised. I would have thought they would be against anyone questioning the official version.
Our perception of what happened on September 11th is very different from the general public's perception, I'd say, for the most part.
I believe that the public is still uninformed about most of the issues that are surrounding them.
I just don't think the public at all knows. They want to believe.
I think the truth sometimes can be frightening.
And there's some deep explaining to do.
The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated properly.
We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
Nobody ever stopped to have a scientific investigation. A scientific investigation.
What did these families know that I didn't? It's obvious by looking online these families have been trying to say something is off, and that we need to look at 9/11 more closely. Their fingerprints are all over rallies, websites, books, and films about that day, but I really didn't hear about that in the mainstream news. So why the emphasis on Building 7? Frankly, I barely even remember that a third building fell that day. Either way, it sounded like a good starting point. I officially began to look into Building 7 for myself. Here are some basic facts. World Trade Center 7, which was located in downtown New York City, is sometimes called the Salomon Brothers Building, but is most commonly referred to as Building 7. Construction for it began in 1984. It was a 47-story, steel-framed skyscraper, standing 570 feet tall. It was 300 feet from the nearest tower, the North Tower, or about a football field away. Even though it was one of the largest buildings in Manhattan, it looked small next to the Twin Towers. Building 7 would be the tallest building in 33 states. It collapsed at 5:20 p.m. the afternoon of September 11th. Even though Building 7 was not hit by an airplane, the official explanation for all the buildings that collapsed was that intense fires weakened the steel, resulting in total building failure. The official story goes on to state that column 79 gave out first, starting a progressive failure of the remaining columns, which allowed the building to fall almost as fast as a bowling ball would into its own footprint. If a building that size accidentally collapsed on any other day, it would have been as famous as the Titanic sinking. Yet according to a 2006 Zogby poll, 43% of Americans never heard of Building 7. Building 7 housed the CIA's largest station outside of Washington, D.C. It also contained the Secret Service's biggest field office. The IRS, Department of Defense, and the SEC also occupied entire floors. The mayor's emergency management bunker was located in the building as well, but ironically it was not used that day. The rest of the tenants were primarily banks such as Salomon Smith Barney, which occupied the top 17 floors. Many government and SEC documents for cases primarily against Wall Street banks, but also including WorldCom and Enron, were destroyed, crippling the investigation of thousands of cases. At this point, I didn't think that things were too strange. I'd accumulated a few questions, but nothing earth-shattering. I did, however, find it a little odd that falling debris could set off a chain of events, ultimately turning Building 7 into a pile of rubble. But I really didn't understand the physics involved, at least not yet. At the time, I had no reason to doubt the official version. I was curious about that collapse, though. It didn't seem logical that the whole building would crash at the same time. I could understand the Twin Towers because they'd been hit by planes, but no plane hit Building 7. Sometimes it's easier for me to tackle complex issues with simple metaphors. So I thought of a stove, and I thought, what kind of materials would I need to add so that the fire would ultimately lead to a collapse of the four legs. How long would it have to burn? And from that perspective, it didn't even seem possible. My next move was to give myself a crash course in building fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history. This was just a 5-year period. Let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building in 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers. Yet it stood. It's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It is still in use. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central building in Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building, burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired, and it is in use today. One Meridian Plaza, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1991, burned for 18 hours. It stood. It's still in use as well. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. It burned for 6 hours in 2009. It stood. Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant occurrences include February 13, 1975, when the 9th through the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening in the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And in 1993, it survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was, of course, damage from the bomb, which had to be repaired, but through it all, the towers had always stood. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel frame building in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by...
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
It takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-'60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
Seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen-starved. So the fires were not that hot.
The kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
The amount of energy required to melt the girders, the steel in the tower, cannot be gotten to a melt point with the fuel that was in the airplane. Not possible.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings, and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
The bottom line is this. In the history of building fires, steel frame buildings have never collapsed because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved, but the kerosene or the jet fuel just couldn't do it. Set aside for a minute that only 2 of the buildings are subjected to kerosene. Now think of a kerosene lamp or a kerosene heater. In the history of kerosene lamps, I've never heard of one being melted because the fires were too hot. In fact, the World Trade Center fires were starved of oxygen and therefore heat. You can see it in the black smoke coming from the towers. Yet molten steel was found in the rubble of all 3 buildings. Something else had to provide the heat and energy needed to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel in any of those 3 buildings. And unless you work for NIST, all scientists agree that neither jet fuel nor the furnishings inside those buildings could have heated the steel enough to melt it. And when you consider they fell under very different conditions, this series of events had me quite puzzled. Something else must have been involved in the collapse of the buildings. Okay, so maybe airplanes weakened the structure of the Twin Towers. We'll be looking into that more deeply later. For now, believe it or not, planes have hit buildings 9 other times that I could find, and none fell. Of course, none were hit with planes as large as the ones on 9/11. But that still leaves Building 7. How can you explain it? Can you tell me that if I throw a flaming chunk of metal off of one building, I can make the building next to it collapse in on itself a few hours later? Why do demolition companies even exist if you can just light a few random fires and wait for an implosion? Maybe the steel structure in Building 7 was so badly damaged by falling debris that the entire structure was compromised. It still didn't explain the symmetrical collapse, but I looked anyway. Other buildings that suffered severe structural damage by natural disasters and bombs didn't disintegrate into rubble piles. They held together in some way. Even the buildings around the World Trade Center that suffered much worse damage than Building 7 didn't implode in on themselves. I was starting to get an uneasy feeling about the way those buildings collapsed, especially World Trade Center 7. So let's take a closer look at why.
It just didn't add up, the way the whole thing sort of pile drove itself into the ground and all at near free fall speed.
It collapses straight down into its own footprint at free fall speed. This is uncanny. There's 40,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist this collapse.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
Animation sequence from the National Institute of Standards and Technology for their model, their mathematical model of the collapse of building number 7. And they have the inside members, the one column gave way, which they claim resulted in the collapse of all the surrounding members, and then this precipitated a global collapse. This would just would not be physically possible for a gravitational collapse.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense. Regardless of the engineering, the logic tells you that if you have a single failure at some random point in the building, that the entire building is not going to collapse. Buildings don't break that way.
The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense.
Exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The building would want to topple over. It would want to bend over that weakened area and topple over sideways. What we saw the structures came straight down upon itself.
It cannot happen
that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
At free fall speed, that's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
If you took a billiard ball and dropped at the height of the Twin Towers, and you just merely stopped it and started at every floor in free fall, it would take over 1.5 minutes to reach the ground. The buildings were down in 10 seconds.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it. And there's some delay there. And then the next floor falls with 2 floors, and there's some more delay.
The buildings actually accelerated as they came down, meaning they were not getting resistance from these massive columns in the center of the core of this building. And when it's all finished, the outside walls from the lower floors are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building.
So it's fiction to say that a building as modern as World Trade Center 7 comes down with no resistance, a free fall, which is...
Doesn't add up.
The official explanation was dead wrong.
That's impossible.
Not possible.
Just doesn't make sense. It's not how it works.
It can't happen.
Never before in history.
Well, it just can't happen. Well, that's just nonsense.
And that cannot happen.
Couldn't happen.
It's fiction.
There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
This was a controlled event.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
In short, the evidence is clear. We are witnessing not the collapse of a building, but its demolition.
At the time, I was thinking, wait a minute. My heart was pounding, my adrenaline was flowing, and I had a knot in my stomach. The collapse never looked right to me, but then again, I never really thought that it defied the laws of physics. Could the hijackers have wired the buildings? Maybe the government didn't want us to know how really lax our security was, and that's why they covered up this fact. Maybe it was pre-wired for some reason, but that made no sense. If it was a controlled demolition, it would explain how those buildings were reduced to neat piles of rubble. It would explain why the towers fell after burning for only an hour or so. It would explain why they imploded instead of tearing apart. It would explain why they all fell at free fall speed. It sure looked like a controlled demolition, in retrospect. I couldn't stop at this point. I needed to know more. Late nights, coffee, research, my life was changing before my very eyes. I had taken my very first step down the rabbit hole. Little did I know how much deeper it would go. By now I knew fire couldn't bring the buildings down. And even if fire could somehow melt steel, the buildings would not have fallen in on themselves. I was starting to find a lot of credible people talking about controlled demolitions and the use of explosives and molten steel. I was also starting to run across instances of forehand knowledge of the event, which we'll get into later. It was very unsettling, but it did tie in with the planning needed to wire a building for a controlled demolition. My mind kept wandering, trying to imagine who and why and how all this tied together. But first, I still needed to understand exactly what did happen.
Find down there is pools of molten iron.
What does that mean?
Several tons. Exactly. What is that doing there? The first responders see it. The structural engineers see it. It's documented by FEMA, the melting of steel. Normal office fires is what's supposed to have brought these buildings down, along with jet plane impacts. The jet fuel and office fires don't produce molten iron or molten steel. It doesn't begin to melt until 3,000 degrees.
The concept of molten steel is very important here. In order to get molten steel, you have to reach unbelievable heat levels. It takes much, much more energy than you could find with burning office furniture or gravity. Molten steel is an indication of the use of thermite. Thermite, thermate, and nanothermite are super hot burning substances used by controlled demolition companies and the military. It can supply its own oxygen so it can burn underwater. It would explain how fires burned at ground zero for 3 months even after the area was flooded.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at ground zero. The fires lasted for quite a while.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning.
The fires were finally put out on December 13th, 2001, a couple days more than 3 months after 9/11, making it the longest burning building fire in recorded history. They burned underwater for much of that time. These fires were a big question mark. But first, it was time to take a closer look at NIST, the main source for the entire government story. It was their report that shaped the 9/11 Commission and the version of events reported by the media. They are the scientific agency establishing proof of the official version of events as most Americans know them. What I would find out about NIST would be shocking. To understand NIST, you need to understand their relationship to explosives. They have vehemently denied that there were any. Not only did they not check for them, they state there were none used, plain and simple. In fact, they have gone to unbelievable lengths to prove that explosives or even the evidence of explosives, like pops going off or molten steel, did not exist. Some people might call it incompetence. Others might call it selling your soul.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming.
NIST computed what they claimed would be the minimum loudness of an explosion that could sever column 79 with a single blast. Then they claimed no observers detected explosions as loud as their predictions.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
On the basis of this artificial threshold of interest, they swept aside all evidence of actual explosions and concluded that no explosives contributed to the destruction of the building.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or...
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the... Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
Secondary explosions, sometimes described as pops or booms, are mini detonations apart from the primary explosion or the plane impacts. These types of explosions are routine in a controlled demolition. They were heard in all three buildings long before any collapsed.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Do you know anything about those extra explosions we heard?
No, I do not.
Were they car bombs?
I have no idea, ma'am.
That sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
You heard explosions, like boom.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the 4th one we've heard.
CNN is now reporting that there was a 3rd explosion at the World Trade Center.
Equally unempirical is the treatment by NIST and Popular Mechanics of reports of explosions before and during the collapses. Both documents pretend that there were no explosions.
Okay, you get the point. Why was NIST denying these explosions? Why are they a big deal? Well, those explosions are a strong sign of a controlled demolition, but they're not proof positive of one. If it was a controlled demolition, there would be other signs like particles in the dust and molten steel.
So their preferred method of dealing with this problem was to ignore or even deny the reports. John Gross, one of the chief authors of the NIST report, was captured on film while he was making a public presentation, saying that he knew of absolutely no eyewitness who has said there was a pool of molten steel.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the tower.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry, like lava.
The fires got very intense down there and it actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
Basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
Then I was at the site 2 weeks after it happened with Governor Pataki, right? And they had to cease digging that day. You know why? They were finding pockets of molten liquid metal.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
About 7 minutes before its final destruction, almost an hour after the plane hit, molten metal was seen coming out of the northeast corner near the 80th floor.
What was going on here? These guys at NIST are the official version. NIST said the fires burned at 1800 degrees, but jet fuel and office furnishings burned between 500 to 800 degrees, so that's not true. NIST said the 1800 degrees they claimed existed was just enough to weaken and bend the steel, which led to complete and simultaneous failure of each building's infrastructure. But that can't be true simply for the fact that you need another 1000 degrees to start to melt steel, much less liquefy it, which would put temperatures around 3500 degrees. NIST did agree that 1800 degrees was as hot as it could have possibly gotten, but that is not nearly enough to make pools of molten steel. So they just denied that molten steel existed, and they denied that witnesses heard the secondary explosions going off. Even the NIST computer animation of Building 7's collapse is inaccurate, showing the outer structural walls crumpling in instead of coming straight down.
The NIST report, on which popular mechanics and much of the press has relied, is not a scientific report. It is a political document.
To have an investigation of NIST themselves. I believe that the reports that came out are not true.
So the fact that NIST says that is absolutely, in my opinion, it's criminal.
NIST wasn't looking for the truth, they were trying to squelch it. But why? Were they asked to sabotage or even falsify their findings? I didn't think they came up with this on their own. When I see John Gross fidgeting as he states there was no molten metal, I see a man that is uncomfortable, maybe because he's doing something that a part of himself disagrees with. It's basic human nature. My feelings at the time were like the moment you catch your significant other in a big lie. Maybe there's an explanation, but it doesn't look good. And if something like that's ever happened to you, you may understand needing to know more, but not wanting to know more, if that makes sense. Was there more evidence of explosives besides just booms and molten steel? I needed more before I could get my head around this. I took a deeper look into all the towers, the airplane strikes, and the possibility of explosives. Mostly I was looking for something to explain away this growing pile of problems. Instead, I would fall further down the rabbit hole.
Most skyscrapers are built on steel or concrete frames, which is a grid of columns and beams that goes all the way through the building. The World Trade Center was different. It was what engineers call a tube structure. It was a very, very strong mesh of steel.
There's a large central rectangle in each of the towers that contained 47 columns, and these columns basically were the primary structural support of the building.
These 47, 48 columns are essentially the superstructure of a battleship. They're essentially a suspension bridge. There's no way that burning kerosene can ever affect these in the least, if only because of the radiator effect. Right?
The core was specifically designed so it could not function as a chimney. They did not want, in the case of a fire, for the fire to be able to travel through the elevators or for air to come in through the elevators.
The minuscule possibility that fire somehow brought all three buildings down was fading fast, if not completely gone. My only hope was that airplanes could have destabilized the building somehow. It didn't explain Building 7, but I was trying to give the official version every possible chance to be right. Let's look at the best documented impact that day. At 9:03, United Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The majority of the jet fuel burned off in the initial impact. But maybe there was an explanation for the collapse in the plane impacts themselves. The first interview I came across was of Frank DiMartini, the manager of the World Trade Center construction.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. The building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element
crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything.
We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
But the plane had already hit. And what I noticed was the lights were still on in the lobby. That led me to believe that the plane never got to the core columns, because the feeds for all these transformers feeding all the light and power in the towers were adjacent to the core column. The plane, the fuel, and the fire that emanated was not sufficient to bring those towers down alone.
Those aircraft and those fires could not cause those buildings to come down in that way.
The idea that airplanes could have destabilized the buildings never made much sense to me. The twin towers were like a solid iron rod coming out of the ground attached to another steel building surrounding it. Let's use another metaphor to clarify what I mean. Let's assume a stop sign is like one of the towers. The post is the core and the thin shield of the sign is the Trade Center's outer mesh. If you shot a bullet through the stop sign, the bullet would go through the outer shell and the inner steel core that holds it up. Is the structure weakened after the event? Is it possible for the sign to implode in on itself, partially turning to dust? Does it matter if it was a flaming bullet that exploded on impact? Could the sign ever collapse in on itself? The plane collision can't explain the symmetry and speed of the collapses. And it certainly can't explain the collapse of Building 7, which wasn't even hit by an airplane. But I had to look. So if it wasn't fire and it wasn't airplanes, then it wasn't natural. Maybe I needed to look for things that can make something like this happen. I'd been holding off on this one, and holding off on the who and the why, for now. One step at a time.
And it's my expert opinion. As a demolition expert, I was trained by the best the U.S. government has. I served 3 years on Underwater Demolition Team 12. 2 years I was attached to SEAL Team 1. And when I look at the buildings and how they fall and the way they fell, they couldn't have come down without being assisted in some manner.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition.
In fact, the evidence shows very strongly that there were explosives used in the way the buildings came down.
We started running floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Explosives are used to demolish buildings like this in just seconds. Okay, so it's a controlled demolition. What's the problem with that? Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
Controlled demolition is used to bring unwanted buildings neatly down into their own footprint. It is part science and part art. Through the placement and synchronization of many different types of explosives, demolition companies can control how and when any building falls. Some are brought down or pulled in a plain Jane fashion, and others as a pyrotechnic show for an active audience. In all, I found 12 elements common to controlled demolitions. We've already covered a few of them. We know the buildings fell at free fall speed and the collapses were symmetrical. Anyone can see that with the naked eye. We've also seen and heard plenty of evidence of molten steel. And the buildings didn't tip over. They came down into neat rubble piles. Lots of people talked about explosions, but it was confusing to me. And of course you're going to be hearing loud noises as a building collapses. This needed further investigation. By now I was only going to trust my own eyes when it came to researching 9/11. Personally, I think it's too important an event to let someone else tell you what to believe about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
With any implosion, you don't hear one massive
boom sound. What you do hear is smaller explosions going off, which leads up to the implosion of the building.
There are 118 documented testimonies of explosions heard from firemen and other first responders alone, which took a court order to get released, and that doesn't include the maintenance employees and regular tower workers. After analyzing locations and timestamps, I broke down the explosions into 3 categories. They are impact synchronized booms, pre-collapse pops, and the final booms and crackle. Let's start by looking at the impact synchronized booms more closely. These massive explosions were timed to go off with the first and second plane strikes respectively. As you'll see, they were a little mistimed. There were 2 of these in total. These were powerful booms in the basement of each building. These sounded like huge blasts or rumbles, depending on where you were. William Rodriguez, a 20-year maintenance employee of the Trade Center, was decorated for saving many people that day. He was in the building when the first plane hit. Let's hear what he and a few others have to say about a subterranean explosion just before the first plane impact.
We heard an explosion. It was a huge explosion that came from under my feet, meaning that it came from the sub-levels between B2 and B3. And then there was a huge explosion at the top of the building. You could hear the difference from the bottom and all the way through the top.
They were having coffee in the World Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb.
Just got out of the tunnel and it blew. The subway tunnel? Yeah.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out and I helped him out of to the ambulance.
Skin hanging off? That sounds like an explosion, not jet fuel dripping down elevator shafts as stated in the official version. Why did so many people hear an explosion below ground? It would make sense, since a collision wouldn't have blown glass out, not to mention that the base of the building would have felt the least amount of vibration as the shock wave was absorbed by the 80 floors above it. Remember, these images are from before the second plane strike, meaning these were recorded between 8:46 and 9:03 a.m. The only thing that had happened so far is a plane impact around the 85th floor of this building.
Parker was the first chief into the building. Right away, a guy from the Port Authority told him the damage was somewhere above the 78th floor. But all you had to do was look around. It was obvious. Something had happened right there in the lobby.
FDNY fireman John Schrader arrived in the North Tower, the first tower hit, within minutes of the impact. By then, the North Tower's lobby had already been destroyed.
We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. You know, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
At the time, I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped.
With so many people talking about the explosions at street level, it would make sense that early reports had the FBI and others looking into bombs at the base of the buildings.
Apparently what appears to happen was that at the same time 2 planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
They have reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it.
I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. There was another explosion which took place. According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
Ginny Carr was recording a business meeting near the Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. on 9/11 when we hear the basement explosion. 9 seconds later, we can hear the plane hitting the tower.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby
first, then a plane hit the building, but then another plane hit the other building.
Now let's discuss these pre-collapse pops. From a distance they sound like pops, but they're actually pretty powerful. Hundreds of secondary explosions were reported at various times prior to the collapse of all three buildings. In a controlled demolition, these bangs are shaped charge explosives blowing out beams before a collapse. They can be programmed to go off hours or seconds before an implosion. These were mostly reported as secondary explosions by first responders and reporters.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impact.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
The third type of explosions heard were the final booms and crackle. This is like the grand finale of a fireworks show. In a controlled demolition, the vast majority of the explosives are set to go off in an ordered fashion over the span of a few seconds as the building collapses. Depending on distance, this can sound like a rumble, booms, or crackling.
That feeling that there was something else, that there may have been something else that brought those buildings down.
There was a lot of talk there in New York of another explosion prior to the collapse of the first building.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Notice what sounds like a rumble from across the river. White smoke begins to rise from the street. 9 seconds later, the collapse begins. Keep in mind that sound travels slower than eyesight. It seems the microphone is picking up an explosion or series of explosions before the building starts to collapse. Eventually, the microphone picks up the constant rumble of the actual implosion. White smoke is caught emanating from the ground floor before the collapse wave arrives. It's an unsteady camera, but understand that whoever captured the smoke was running for their life. In this photograph, recently released through a Freedom of Information Act request, a police department photograph captures a blast originating near the base of the South Tower just prior to its collapse. The explosions and shockwave before Building 7's collapse was captured in different ways.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shockwave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out.
It was hard to ignore what that looked like, now that I was more familiar with controlled demolitions. My level of uneasiness grew as I looked deeper into 9/11. Too many things weren't adding up. Or should I say, too many things were starting to add up. In the end, the evidence of explosions was ignored by the organizations behind the official version, like NIST, FEMA, Popular Mechanics, and the 9/11 Commission. My independent search continued. Up next, a kink in the roof. It's not necessary for there to be a kink in the roof of an imploding building, but when it does happen, it's a pretty sure indication of a controlled demolition. The roof can only kink in when the central support columns are blown out first, meaning the destruction of the building is coming from inside it, not outside. This is done by design so the building falls in on itself. The kink in Building 7 is clearly visible to the naked eye. Watch the penthouse sink into the floor below it before the collapse begins. Now look at it from this angle. Next on the list. Squibs are the 7th indicator of a controlled demolition. In demolition vernacular, squibs refer to visible blasts from explosive charges. Often they are visible through mistiming or malfunction in some way. Usually they are hidden in the debris cloud. In simple terms, squibs are visual evidence of explosives. Squibs are recorded from the moment of the plane impacts through the collapse of the towers. For me, they went unnoticed until I looked at the video more closely. These stills captured squibs as the towers collapsed. I didn't think poofs of smoke should be coming out of buildings whose fires are dozens of floors above. The official version stated these squibs were compressed air caused by the pancaking floors, which squeezed the air to the point of bursting out a window. The seal of the building was broken when the collapse began. Logically, if it was compressed air, it should have found the path of least resistance through the broken part of the building. It shouldn't have knocked out a window here or a window there, as many as 40 floors below the blast wave.
Naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. It doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. Estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The following clips show multiple squibs popping out, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes dozens of floors away from each other. Of all of the 9/11 information I've come across, this may have been the easiest to spot, and yet it provided me with one of those stark moments in which the reality of 9/11 sunk in to a new level. In this clip, notice how the blast occurred before the floors above reached the blast ejection point. In this footage, a large blast of fire is seen when the collapse begins an hour and 42 minutes after impact for the North Tower, after the fuel and furnishings had presumably burned up. Where did the energy come from to create that fireball? Not all squibs, however, were easy to spot. Remember we discussed explosions that were timed to go off with the plane impacts? This is the first plane impact. Notice the dark brown smoke coming out of the top floor. This smoke is already dissipating before the plane even strikes the building. In this segment, the NBC camera is pointed at the North Tower, the first tower hit. In a few seconds, the second tower is going to be hit. You'll know it when it happens because of the reporter's voice and the fireball in the lower left corner of the screen. Now keep your eye focused on the east facade, the one on the left. Notice how several tiny explosions go off as the second plane hits the other building. Perhaps this was in an effort to mask some necessary work prior to the North Tower's demolition, as I was thinking at the time.
Another one just hit. Something else just hit.
The eighth characteristic of a planned implosion is what's called a demolition wave. It is the path of destruction in a controlled demolition. It is a visible wave of explosions moving down the columns of a building just ahead of or at the speed of gravity. This array of synchronized explosives is timed to blow out floors beneath the collapse wave as the floors above reach the floors below, thus allowing a drop at freefall speed. Again, let's slow down the film for some of these. When slowed down, you can see how the explosions are timed to go off, floor by floor. In this clip, you can clearly see a demolition wave proceeding down a column mostly hidden by the umbrella of the falling debris pile. Look to the right of the black line. It's a bit grainy because of the zoom. Here it is again without the black line. You can see synced explosives cutting a path down the building. The demolition wave can be hard to see with an untrained eye because it happens so fast. I've tried to highlight a few more examples in the following clips. Often buildings being demolished will have a mesh around them to keep projectiles from shooting away. In the case of the Twin Towers, there were thousands of pieces of steel jettisoned out much further than they could have if it were a gravitational collapse. Some pieces were ejected laterally over 300 feet. Some of these pieces weighed as much as 300 tons. Listen to what a few experts had to say on the topic.
The beams and the window mullions and things went up and out. That kind of stuff can't happen with just pure air pressure of floors getting sandwiched together.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The fragments which are being, which is coming out of the tower, obviously being kicked out by explosive action.
And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
I'm no physicist, but if this was a natural collapse, there is no way that multi-ton beams can land 400 yards away. I've lived in high-rises my whole life, and I've thrown things off my balcony. Things like spoons and plates, things that are much more aerodynamic than steel beams. And all they do is fall straight down. Nothing has ever ended up across the street. In this diagram, notice that it was the building material from the middle floors that was ejected furthest from the base, completely defying logic, or I should say the logic of a natural gravitational collapse. It fit perfectly with the mounting ocean of evidence that these buildings were brought down by demolition. In some of these clips, you can see projectiles actually propelled upward, forming an arc. If this were a gravitational collapse, pieces could not be shot upward. And consider the pieces we see. The small pieces weigh a few hundred pounds and the biggest pieces weigh several hundred tons. In this clip, a 300-ton steel box column had so much lateral force it pierced the building across the street. To give you an idea of its size, here you can see a construction worker standing at the base of the box column when it was being installed. This was yet another item checked off the list for me. The evidence was getting overwhelming. I'll discuss my feelings as I discovered all of this later, but to be thorough, let's finish. 10. Angle cuts. Angle cuts are visible signs of sliced steel support beams in the aftermath of an implosion. They are linear cuts of the steel in place of where we should see steel torn apart. Shape charges are incendiary explosives wired to steel columns that are designed to cut through any thickness of steel, leaving an unnatural slice mark, a linear slice mark, as opposed to seeing the beams torn apart in a natural collapse. These are only found in controlled demolitions. They were found all over Ground Zero.
In 1984, there was a patent issued for thermite cutter charges to be used in building demolitions that could shoot molten iron through the structural steel in milliseconds.
They are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which through a series of beams cut at the same angle will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
They can use radio control to initiate the firing of the explosives. They have to be done in a sequence in order to get the building to come down rapidly and straight down.
And what we should have had was a bunch of floors pancaked at the bottom with these spikes sticking out.
How can those steel columns, the massive steel columns that they are, supporting that weight of that building, virtually disappear? Why aren't they poking up straight out of that rubble at the bottom of the building?
Number 11. Pulverization. In a controlled demolition, much of the building material is pulverized into dust, helping to form a pyroclastic cloud. The pulverization of materials is a byproduct of explosives and it's
unbelievable. Like I said, there wasn't a door, there wasn't anything to be found. It was all disintegrated, all rubble.
So much material was turned into ash, which even I knew by now requires way more energy than gravity can provide. From the moment this photograph was taken, the top of the tower should have fallen straight down and kept its form in some way. Instead, what we got at Ground Zero is what looks like a pile of toothpicks. I also find it ironic that the only part left standing was the base of the building. Even though the whole building landed on it, it was the only part of the building whose columns did not become dismembered. Perhaps that says something about the difficulty of wiring the atrium in the towers. And maybe these columns at the base did what the rest of the building should have done, and that is stay together in some way. Just a personal observation I'd made at the time. Nonetheless, the 12th and final sign of controlled demolition lies in the dust residue. Even though the cleanup and removal of the Ground Zero evidence began within hours of the attacks, not all of it was removed. Several dust samples were ultimately analyzed by physicists led by Dr. Stephen Jones, and what was found in these dust samples was the final nail in the coffin of the official story for me. We touched on thermite earlier, but we're going to look into it more deeply for reasons you'll soon find out. Thermite is a chemical mixture, usually of metal oxide and aluminum powder, with several variations. It's usually used in fireworks, underwater welding, building demolition, and military weapons. When thermite is detonated, it leaves two specific traces of itself in the debris. One is in the microscopic spheres of melted steel produced during the reaction, and the second is the unexploded thermite itself, in the form of tiny red-gray chips in this case, both of which were found in the Ground Zero dust samples. The fact that thermite was found in the dust did not surprise me, at least not by now. I already knew this had to be a controlled demolition. What blew my mind was the type of thermite found. Actually, it made my heart sink. You see, it was a very special type of thermite, called nanothermite, and it meant that the odds that the hijackers could have done this dropped to near zero. The implications of this particular finding would radically change my life more than any other. We'll discuss that in a bit. For this one, let's have the experts walk us through it.
What can melt steel and explain all the evidence? Independent scientists began to piece that evidence together, and they suggested some type of thermitic material must have been used as part of the tower's demolition.
in 3 different samples from 3 independent researchers. The R.J. Lee Company, the USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work. All 3 separately found these microspheres.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres.
We learned of very small spheres of iron found all through the dust. That iron must have been molten, allowing surface tension to pull it into those spheres.
You cannot get a perfectly round sphere of metal from the building tearing apart. The only way you can get that is by starting with a molten liquid. Then the hydrostatic pressure will create the perfectly round sphere as it solidifies.
So what produced all that molten iron? Well, it has in it the chemical evidence of a special incendiary, which is thermite, a high-tech incendiary used to cut through steel like a hot knife through leather. These spheres have iron, aluminum, fluorine, manganese, very unusual elements associated only with thermite. And there's small chips of unignited thermite as well.
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips.
We captured the residue after the material had been heated. The red-gray chips, as we ignite them, produce spheres that have iron and aluminum, just like we see in the dust in abundance.
And the composition was very, very similar. And that led to the conclusion of the paper, which was, we've got some form of thermite in these red-gray chips.
What I can confirm also is that these chips, the red layer is thermitic. It does produce molten iron.
Heard this argument that somehow perhaps someone seeded these samples with nanothermite.
There have been some that have argued that these red-gray chips could be paint of some form.
I've also heard the argument that perhaps the falling buildings just generated this nanothermite. Well, no.
So it wasn't, the red-gray chips are not the primer paint that was used on the WTC steel.
These chips are not naturally occurring. They are not going to form because some materials fall down in a building and touch each other and get compressed together. That's just not what this material is.
100% of these nanoscientists contacted said no. There's no way that a falling building can create this sophisticated material.
This material is not normal thermite. That's the other thing that really needs to be understood.
What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just 2 powders being mixed.
First of all, the iron oxide grains are uniform and approximately 100 nanometers across. That's very tiny, much smaller than a human hair. The aluminum occurs in plates that are about 40 nanometers across. I have no idea how to make those. I mean, this is a high-tech material, and it's embedded in a carbon-rich matrix with order. These red-gray materials have very orderly sheets containing aluminum.
This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
The aluminum appears in thin platelets about 40 nanometers thick. It is the small size of the particles involved in this material that allow us to characterize it as nanothermite.
These really are sophisticated materials and probably only developed in a laboratory.
Unlike conventional thermite, this stuff is a very high-tech explosive.
This is very high-tech thermite, nanothermite. It's not found in a cave in Afghanistan. It's produced in very sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories.
We compared our spike that we got with a spike from known nanothermite, which is produced at a military laboratory. Their measured energy released with known nanothermite was less than these red-gray chips.
What we are dealing with, I think, in World Trade Center is modern military material which is unknown to the general public.
It takes steel and it creates molten steel. So it takes beams of steel and it turns it into molten steel, and it just everything underneath just sinks into the ground like what you saw. And it is a special U.S. military grade weapon.
So the military uses it for a number of different applications.
Is that military grade thermite was used to bring the building down.
Okay? It is a military grade weapon. It's not something you could make ever.
I was stunned. This rabbit hole was getting deeper, but I still had no idea how deep. Of course, by now I knew this was a planned demolition. Maybe you can explain squibs, but how do you explain explosions or the molten steel? And if you explain that, how do you explain free fall or thermite in the dust? I had to face facts, no matter what my heart wanted to believe. These buildings were wired to blow, plain and simple. Logic beat out my former dismissive, conventional thinking self, who would have never considered any of this remotely possible before. But it wasn't until understanding nanothermite and how it's made and who has it that I considered, for the first time, that someone other than the hijackers had to be involved. And as scary as it was to consider, it might even be homegrown. Hundreds of questions were competing for space in my little brain. Why would underfunded, unsophisticated guys in caves pay to make or buy nanothermite? Who would sell it to them? How did they get access to the buildings every day? How did they detonate Building 7 long after they died? If you have the means, and go to the trouble of getting nanothermite and wiring the building, why let the plan rest on using box cutters to overthrow military and combat-trained airline pilots, along with dozens of passengers? Why bother killing yourself in a plane crash at all if it wasn't needed to take the buildings down? I had no idea what I was staring at least not yet, but a few dots had been filled in. I knew that the buildings were brought down by a controlled demolition, military thermite was used, NIST was being used to sell a lie, and someone wanted us to think that planes caused this. I kept replaying the event in my head over and over, assimilating each new piece of information as I discovered it. And like a retreating army, my line in the sand about what could have really happened kept moving further and further back, and getting closer to home. But I was on a mission, and I was obsessed to find out the truth. Researching late every night was starting to disrupt my home life. My wife didn't exactly see eye to eye with me about 9/11. Back then, she still believed the official version, but she hadn't seen what I had. I think for a time she even thought I was losing it. For a time I wondered at myself, because it was very hard to believe what my eyes were seeing. I couldn't understand the who and the why, with the little that I knew about the what, as in what happened. So I pressed on. If someone wired the building, they had to get past security every day for a while. Remember when I said I lived in high-rises my whole life? Well, I worked in them too. And there is no way you can access buildings like those without the building security knowing and approving it. Lots of equipment had to be brought in. It would take time. There would be drilling and pounding and dust in the ventilation ducts. You can't get a bunch of security guards to willingly let hijackers wire a building, even if they're being paid. Whoever was coming in must have been coming in under different pretenses. They would need access to the guts of the buildings. They would need a plausible reason to be there. They would need a plan. And help from the inside.
They also don't tell you that there were many reports of people who worked in the building saying, you know, we got a shutdown order, so for 3 days we couldn't go in the World Trade Center. There were engineers coming in and out.
I was a computer operator on the night shift Monday night into Tuesday. The previous weekend there had been a power down.
And to have a complete loss of power meant a complete loss of systems. And for an organization like my company, it was truly extraordinary.
The power down started like Friday night close of business, gradually into Saturday morning.
We were given 3 weeks notice.
But it was off completely for a good 24 to 36 hours.
That meant that everything was gone in terms of security.
It would have affected camera security. It would have affected all the secure systems on doors.
We had guided tours coming into secured areas by mistake and nobody picking it up because there's no intrusion alarms or anything else.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Video cameras caught trucks arriving at the World Trade Center from about August 23rd until every night until about September 2nd, September 3rd. And the trucks were arriving at about 3 o'clock in the morning when everybody else had left the building, including the janitors.
The columns could have been set up with explosive devices during the off-hour operations of the building by elevator company personnel.
It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts.
How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization.
And in the case of a steel frame building, that means we load them with RDX cutting charges, which are loaded with individual delays, sometimes as many as 2 to 3 different delays on a given floor.
I was sick to death of the dust which was appearing on the windowsills. It was dirty grey and very, very noticeable in that week leading up to 9/11.
There were workers throughout the World Trade Center that had access to the hoistway, which is immediately adjacent to the core columns and beams in the building.
The fact that there were visitors, like engineers of some kind, wandering around the floors, carrying toolboxes and cables and so on.
Something was brought into that building that would help with the detonation. There may have been work done on the detonation before. It may have been going on for months, but whatever they needed at the very end, they came and brought in that 10-day period.
We're talking about several tons of nanothermite and ordinary thermite. One would have to have access through security.
The 9/11 Commission also does not tell you that Marvin Bush, the president's brother, and their cousin, Wirt Walker, were the principals of the company that was in charge of security for the World Trade Center. They don't,
The jaw-dropping coincidences kept piling up. I learned that Stratesec was a security company which used to be called Securicom, and they didn't just handle security for the World Trade Center complex. They had contracts with Dulles International Airport, from where Flight 93 departed, and United Airlines, accounting for about 3/4 of the security breakdowns on 9/11. And one other thing, Stratesec also handles security for Los Alamos National Labs, one of the only places on the planet that can produce the nanothermite found in the ground zero dust. The odds that one company can link so many vital elements of 9/11 is pretty astonishing. But more astonishing is there's no mention of Stratesec or Securicom in the entire 567-page 9/11 Commission report. Of course, that was no surprise by now. Did I forget to mention that the same 9/11 Commission did not mention Building 7 a single time in the entire report either?
Why is there not a word about the collapse of that building in the 9/11 Commission report?
We didn't see any evidence of the kind of thing you're talking about.
I didn't think this was something done by a terrorist anymore, nor did I think this was done by a president. How does he get nanothermite? How does he get NORAD, the FAA, and our air defenses to look the other way? Or get access to the interior of all 3 towers? Or get 19 guys to kill themselves? Or get NIST and the 9/11 Commission to tank their investigations? Or keep the media quiet? Or keep a rival administration from exposing it? Now, this seemed much bigger than even a president, and impossible for a man on the run. If someone like me with a budget of 0 can find something wrong with Building 7's collapse, how could an entire government commission not even mention it? Something big and strange was coming into view, seemingly coordinated and almost invisible, like 1,000 puzzle pieces dumped out before me. I couldn't see the bigger picture yet, but I knew there was one. It would still be months before one emerged. All this reminded me of a quote that struck me in Woodrow Wilson's book, The New Freedom. He writes, Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacturing are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they'd better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. I was starting to wonder if we were talking about the same thing. So I continued my independent research. I didn't even need to remind myself I was falling down the rabbit hole anymore. I was now fully expecting to see the unexpected. It felt like I was just scratching the surface of 9/11, but I was getting overwhelmed. I would go on to investigate the media and other instances of pre-knowledge of the event before taking a few weeks off to process everything. And that's where we'll end part 1. So we're almost there. Remember the opening chapter, The Dog That Didn't Bark? It was a reference to a Sherlock Holmes story called Silver Blaze, in which Holmes deduces the culprit must have known the family dog.
But even then, they said, hey, you know, like, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about taking this building down. They're not sure if it's stable or not. So they were holding a line off because they had knowledge that something was going to happen.
By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word. We're going to have to bring it down. And
you hear that? Keep your eye on that building; it'll be coming down soon.
I didn't hear any creaking, or I didn't hear any indication that it was going to come down. And all of a sudden, the radios exploded, and everybody started screaming, "Get away! Get away! Get away from it!" The whole time you hear him thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
And we were in a building in which we were trapped for about 10-15 minutes. And we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. The World Trade Center was going to collapse. It was going to collapse.
But the media's pre-knowledge was much more telling. Remember I promised we'd look at the premature news reports on the collapse of Building 7 more closely? Several news outlets around the country and even internationally reported the collapse of Building 7 long before it happened. I listened closely to these segments. Considering Building 7 wasn't hit by an airplane and no building has ever collapsed because of fire, how was it that all these news outlets would predict this impossible thing in the first place and then all get it wrong in the exact same way? Where did all these reporters get this piece of identical yet erroneous information?
The latest building collapse in New York, you might have heard a few moments ago, was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were.
One of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
That has structural damage as well. We saw a lot of glass broken out, and a corner of the building appeared to be in distress, and there's concern that there might actually be another collapse of that building.
We are getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. Is that smoke coming from this third collapse? Okay, that is what we're understanding, which makes sense because it looks like the sun is going down. But I'm hoping that enough people have cleared out of downtown Manhattan so that perhaps it wasn't as full as it might be normally around 5:30 on a Tuesday.
That information, of course, take a look at that right-hand side of the screen.
It's going
Okay.
down right now.
There it is.
Yep.
It went down.
Brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. Heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next.
New York very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working properly, the subway lines are not working.
The media has played an important role in shaping the official story. The idea that buildings fell because of planes and fire was instilled in the public's conscience early and often on 9/11. It started before any buildings fell.
Actually right now, which will give you an idea of the type of impact we're talking about.
And that perhaps they're buckling under the force of the collision or the hole that's resulted from these two planes.
My sense is that just the velocity of the plane and the fact that you have a plane filled with fuel hitting that building that burned.
So structural damage, as you had suggested, probably led to this building going down.
We are seeing. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attack.
And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
And now we are told that there's a fire there, and that building may collapse as well, as you can see.
Airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief.
Consider it like this. Let's say a man's wife gets into a car accident by running a red light. A broken liquor bottle is found in the wrecked car. Police investigate and conclude drunk driving. Open and shut case, right? But later it's discovered the husband composed an email the day before his wife's accident announcing his grief over the tragedy. Would that indicate to you that there was more to this story? What if later the receipt for the liquor purchase was found in his name and it turned out the brake lines of her car were cut? I was having a hard time comprehending the level of deception involved, particularly the boldness of it. It reminded me of a quote often attributed to Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for Hitler's Nazi Germany, who stated that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Did I think all of these reporters were in on it? No. I think most just do what they're told to keep their job and don't bother to really understand building structures or fire dynamics. With that said, it was still troubling to find a pattern of bullying, intimidation, and belittling of anyone asking valid questions. Actually, it made me quite angry.
We're not buying it.
Okay, you don't have to buy anything. You're American. You want to be a nut, you can be a nut. And you are a nut.
Thinks that 9/11 was carried out by the government isn't a truther. They're idiots.
I'm merely saying it is wrong, blasphemous, and sinful for you to suggest, imply, or help other people come to the conclusion that the U.S. government killed 3,000 of its own citizens, because it didn't.
How big a lunatic do you have to be to watch two giant airliners packed with jet fuel slam into buildings on live TV, igniting a massive inferno that burned for 2 hours, and then think, well, if you believe that was the cause?
These people are idiots. They're mentally ill. They should be treated with respect. It's an insult to people who were victims of 9/11 and their families.
You know what? It wasn't an inside job. We can see the planes. The planes hit the building. It wasn't a controlled demolition, and the buildings came down. It just is beyond bizarre.
Yeah, and you are a nutcase, Building 7.
9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life. Get a life. 9/11 was an inside job.
You're like the guys who think that the space aliens kidnapped Elvis or something like that. That's where you are.
I didn't think it was accidental how any question is dismissed uniformly. This didn't feel like journalism as much as it felt like name-calling or propaganda, or mild brainwashing even. Most reasonable people would question the official story after seeing what we've seen. Is it so implausible to not even allow a question? I wondered what motivated them, because it obviously wasn't a search for the truth. Well, so much for mainstream news. I started going to independent news sources. No, they're not well-funded, slick, or glitzy. They're just regular people trying to expose the truth about something in their corner of the world. One such man was Bill Cooper. I found him early in my 9/11 research. At the time, I couldn't have explained how he knew what you're about to hear. Bill Cooper spent his life in the intelligence community. He rose to the Office of Naval Security and Intelligence, serving on the intelligence briefing team for the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He held several top security clearances, After the military, he developed the largest civilian intelligence agency in the world.
Largest and most successful civilian intelligence gathering operation in the world, which makes me privy to an awful lot of information that none of you will ever see.
The following clip is from his radio program, which aired on June 28, 2001, 76 days before 9/11 happened.
A CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, his top lieutenants and colonels and generals in their hideout. This is a CNN reporter with a camera crew. And he came out and told everybody, within 3 weeks, Osama bin Laden is going to attack the United States and Israel. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. When in hell are all you people going to wake up?
All these early news reports were glaring misfires in what seemed to be an otherwise coordinated media campaign. Misfires not unlike the ones meant to coincide with the first plane impact. Little mistakes that my untrained eye never picked up before, but that I was now finding all over, spawning even more questions, and fueling the early stages of what would become my spiritual awakening. As I continued finding evidence leading me away from the official version, it was not surprising that the main body of evidence at Ground Zero was being removed within hours of the attacks, cleaning up a crime scene with no real investigation.
Because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And
I was starting to believe that things like the immediate cleanup were probably no accident. And discover what was really happening, I need to find the ones behind the cleanup and the coordinated media and NIST and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which in another huge coincidence arrived in New York for a training exercise on Monday, September 10th, the night before 9/11, which is convenient as they oversaw the cleanup of Ground Zero.
To be honest with you, we arrived on late Monday night and went into action on Tuesday morning. And not until today did we get a full opportunity to work the entire site.
Over time, it got easier to find puzzle pieces, like the following testimony by Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation in 2001, who was with Vice President Dick Cheney on the morning of 9/11. And like so much other important information, this interview would also be left out of the 9/11 Commission report.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
The Mineta testimony launched my investigation into the Pentagon, Shanksville, the hijackers, and many other aspects of 9/11. And if I thought I was a long way down the rabbit hole already, was I way wrong. My belief system would ultimately be shattered, but rebuilt to accommodate my evolving worldview. Back then, however, I was only a few months into my investigation, and I was going through a full scope of emotions, and frankly having a difficult time handling all of them. Denial, curiosity, fear, disbelief, paranoia, anger, and heartbreak, and I would go through many more. I was still unable to reconcile all the data in front of me. I couldn't see the bigger picture at the time. But like the wind, it can't be seen, yet we know it's there because it leaves evidence of its existence. Very much like the trail of breadcrumbs I'd been researching over the last few months. But it's not something I could understand in one sitting. It took time. Coping with the flood of emotions took a while. I didn't have anyone guiding me or anyone to talk to about it. At the time, I didn't know how big this movement is, with millions of people, thousands of organizations, and a branch of therapy dedicated to it. Knew nothing about it. I was in denial.
Denial, which is probably the most primitive psychological defense, is the one most likely to kick in when our beliefs are challenged.
For a time, it felt like I had no foundation, like the ground was crumbling beneath me. And I won't be the last person to feel that, but it comes and goes quickly. The roller coaster of emotions is a lot to take in. That's why I stopped part one after only looking at the Trade Center portion of the attacks. There's so much more to this, but it's easier to process in small chunks.
And so I see that with people, and I saw that with myself when my brother tried to talk with me about it. Don't mess with me, don't mess with my home, don't mess with my comfort with how things are.
In spite of my inner resistance, I did the math. It's not like there's a decimal point out of place. This picture's made up of 1,000 little dots. Not all are filled in, but you can still see a picture. Sorting through all the questions took a while too, but they all stemmed from just two. Who really did it, and why? That onion has many layers, but it's not impossible to solve.
Another thing we can do is decide to look at the conflicting evidence and be sincere and be open-minded and look at both sides of the issue and then make up our own mind about what reality is.
It would still be a year before I started coming to my own conclusions about those mysteries, but at least I was finally awake. The truth is hidden by several mechanisms, including the limits of our own preconceived beliefs. I'd been so ignorant and dismissive, and I don't mean just about 9/11. Personally, I came to believe that we're in a battle of information and beliefs against the ones that did 9/11, a spiritual battle. But 9/11 is only one battle in a much larger war, a war I couldn't see yet, but one that I was on the way to discovering. At one point, my wife asked me, "So now what? What is the point of knowing all of this?" You know, it's a good question, because there were times when I wish I didn't. I believe most people would want to be made aware of this for personal, patriotic, political, social, or religious reasons. And I'm sure there are also people that don't care either. But how can anyone know how you'll react? It's not up to me to tell someone what to do with this information or how to think about it. You have to make your own judgments about what you see. I'm simply telling a story to how I woke up to a few things. I mean no harm to anybody. In terms of patriotism, I've now joined a group filled with millions and growing. And I think understanding this is patriotic, and I think discussing it is more so. And I always want the truth, even if it's hard to hear. As a result, I've become someone whose beliefs are determined by knowledge, as opposed to someone whose knowledge is determined by their beliefs. There's a big difference. I got to choose what to believe in instead of being told what to believe in by others. And I know how to find the truth when I want it. Not to mention that the search was personally fascinating. It got me to read the Bible and understand Jesus' predictions and warnings, which made me believe He's real. I can also better educate my children about how the world works. And I got to build my belief system based on provable evidence, not on preconceived notions. My world is a lot smaller and clearer now. If there's a pit in your stomach, don't be scared. Whatever's behind all this has been there for a long time, at least since 9/11. And I'm sure you've lived, loved, and laughed plenty since then. And you still will. The shock will wear off. And what will be left is a much better understanding of how the world works, which makes the bad guys' jobs a lot harder. I was a little scared and uneasy when I came across this too, but that completely passed. Today I'm able to laugh and play and look forward to the future like everyone else. I have all that, and I'm more aware of the important things that are happening around me. If you decide to jump down the rabbit hole, Do your own research, have an open mind, and see where it takes you. I promise, it'll be an eye-opener.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
From the moment of birth, all we know is the thirst. These devils trying to make the river flow in reverse. All my people on the rooftop, all my people on the ground. Did you really think I came to bring peace? I came for blood to rain on these streets, bang on these beats till we're all awake. They ain't got the balls to haul us all away. Shout out from the rooftop, God is great. All these wannabe cobras just guard as snakes. I'ma shine the light, watch them cower in shame. Got guns, but the flame will devour your brain. It's bigger than freedom, bigger than change. Politicians, citizens, sinners, and saints. Raise the vibration and the shift begins. Where you gonna go with them spaceships and things? Wake up.
I am honoring the memories of those who were lost, okay? I'm honoring my brothers by asking questions.
46% suspect or are sure that it was a controlled demolition.
Investigate 9/11. 9/11 was perpetrated by people within our own government.
In the kingdom of the cowardly lions, undoubtedly the tyrants and keepers of the sleeping giants. From the minds to the Zionists, an overnight messiah, setting fire to the fire. Cause I'm preaching to the quiet kids, speaking in defiance. Read through the lines, keep your eyelids open if you're blind to the science. Can incite riots without violence. Cause Lord willing, no one.
And most people think you're a nut.
To invade our neighbors, paid renegades, take aim at the natives. No hiatus from these faith crusaders. Stage all out wars in the name of the creators. Is it all cause they hate us or underestimate us? Why, Lord, do you forsake the poor like racists? Agents of Satan with the faces of saviors. Bet it takes more than Green Berets with AKs to save us. Trust.
Haven't heard any compelling reason for a new investigation.
Well, if the family members want one, that's all.
9/11 was not an inside job. It was an Osama bin Laden job with 19 people from Saudi Arabia. They murdered 3,000 Americans and other foreigners.
There may be growing skepticism when it comes to the official story on 9/11.
All of the movement has been the other way. It's been people who believe the official story like I did and have taken the time to examine the evidence.
38% of Americans have doubts about the official account of 9/11, and 10% do not believe it at all.
I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was.
The truth can be accessed.